So it's showtime. This is the morning we pour these footings. Dustin really helped me, helping me arrange a pump and some extra manpower because it's a little fussy, you know, getting around these spreaders and the verts and everything, and they need to be nice and flat. And so he got out his magic wand and arranged it, and we're going to pour this morning. And so I've been buttoning up this morning. Buttoning up means you just go over all of the details that could possibly bite you. Double check all the reinforcement, double check your spacing, double check your spreaders, double check everything, and get all the dirt out of the bottom of the footings that's fallen in over time. What you don't do the morning before the pour is wait, get there when the mud shows up and assume everything's going to work. If you do that, you're going to have a problem. What you do is get pumped up with adrenaline, think serious thoughts about how you would correct a mistake if it happened, and then do everything in your power to make sure that mistake doesn't happen. So like every pour that we've ever done, that we've ever shown you, or that I've ever dealt with in my life before the camera, the secret to success with concrete is having the right amount of manpower. In fact, having a little more manpower than you might need is always the right amount. The manpower is just like the concrete itself in that too much is always enough. And so we've got 5 finishers here today. We have probably, it'll be 20 or 21 yards when it's done. This is pretty much going to be a victory lap. All the verts will be in the right spot. It'll be nice and smooth in between the spreaders, and we'll be ready to slam the block in here next week.
I almost always use a pump, and it almost doesn't matter how much concrete I'm pouring. Now there's the occasional little pour where I can get the truck right up to the edge of the form, and it does not make sense to spend the, anywhere between $250 to $350 that it typically takes to put the concrete in place with a pump. But the fact is, a pump pays. Number one, having a pump on the job reduces by at least 1 the number of men you need to have to get the mud in place. And it may reduce the number of men by 4 or 5 if you were wheelbarrowing it like we did in the bad old days. I look back on wheelbarrowing mud. I showed up in concrete right at the very end of that long, dark season in construction. And I realized that concrete pumps now have become as ubiquitous as microwave ovens in the kitchen. Yes, you can get the work done without it, but nobody wants to. The fact that a concrete pump always makes you money by reducing the size of your crew and reducing the waste and reducing the number of times when you have to send a partial load back because it's been sitting there too long and the inspector will not accept the set time in the truck, and any number of other opportunities that a concrete pump brings for making things better leads me to the inescapable conclusion that it's almost always a mistake to do it without one. Now, if you don't know a pumper like Jeff Lorenzen, Brothers Concrete Pumping, start calling the batch plants, talk to the dispatcher, say, hey, who gets called more often than anybody else? Or describe to him your pour, and he will know the pumper who sort of specializes or is particularly good at that sort of concrete work. Now, a concrete pump takes a different mix design than if you're just pouring out of the tailgate. It's got to have a little more sand. It's got to have a little more, it's got to have typically, at least for a line pump, that is a pump that's pulled behind a truck, it needs a little smaller rock. It doesn't like to pump 3/4 inch aggregate unless it's really smooth. So let the batch plant know you're pumping it, let him know who you're hiring to pump it. They will communicate together. The batch plant will make sure that the truck does not get to the job before the pump does. At least that's the way it works around here. And it's going to make a much happier crew and a much better outcome for you as the owner. Now this mix design is about a 4-inch slump, and so vibration, while not optional, is not as vital as it would be with a 1 or a 2-inch slump like the last load that you will see delivered. But it's still nice. It levels it out, it helps the material move into position, reduces the labor a little bit, and consolidates the mix so it adheres to the rebar more perfectly and has a nicer finish at the face of the form. If you've got a vibrator, and if you got time, and if you have the manpower, it's never the wrong answer to vibrate a footing or a wall or anything that really needs to look good when you strip the forms. Anyone who's been in a career very long and is self-aware at all knows that your work always influences who you are, and who you are influences your work. And pretty soon the two are so mixed up that there's no parsing them out, that we become sort of an entity that is defined by our work if we're not careful. But having said all that, I'll just say that I'm lucky, personally and professionally, to know Dustin Furch. He's a good friend and the best concrete finisher anywhere around these parts. Concrete finishing happens in stages, and the stages and the time for each process are always driven by what the concrete wants and where it's at in its transition from a liquid in a truck to a rock on your site. But the first job with getting the concrete, into what you want it to be is to get the right amount of mud in the right place. And once it's there, you strike it off. You cut it to shape. And it is more cutting than smoothing. But as you strike it off, as you pull a rake or a board or a screed or a power screed or whatever you're using to put it in shape, as you pull it across the surface, you're taking the parts that are too high and pushing them into the areas where it's too low. Now that is certainly one of the reasons that a concrete pump is just invaluable on so many jobs, is because the pumper knows from the first moment where he wants to put the mud, and he puts the right amount of mud there, and so it really reduces the effort involved in striking it off. Once the mud is struck off and it's in shape, the right amount of mud in the right place at the right elevation, reasonably flat, you start using different tools. And there are a lot of different tools because there are a lot of different processes and a lot of different stages and finishes and a lot of different approaches to these jobs. And so you use the tool you've got that's the right thing for the stage the concrete is at, and you refine the finish. You consolidate it, you get it smoother and smoother, and all of the particles in tighter and tighter contact with each other. And as you watch this happening, never forget that this is very much the type of thing that looks a lot easier than it actually is. The only way to do this and do it well is to practice. And a footing like this is a great place to practice because it's all going to be buried and nobody's ever going to see it after the masons have done their work and the backfill's in place and the floor's on top. This is just our secret, right? And so if you have a project like this, just figure on doing a little practice and maybe pretend that it's the sidewalk that you want to pour in your backyard maybe next fall. And so you use the tools and see how the edgers work and see the difference between a float and a trowel and get an idea of when you can progress from floating it off to your initial troweling and when it might be ready to actually finish it and maybe put some sealer on it. You can practice all those things on a job like this with no downside, because if you blow it, you blow it. It's still going to bury and it's still going to hold up the house. Now, you've seen most of these guys before. They were here when we poured the retaining walls on this project. A couple of them are new additions and are here today because Dustin was sort of scrambling to line up the manpower, and so he placed calls to several people, and they all said, one said yes and one said no, and then the other said no and the other said yes, and at the end of the day they all could do it and they all had scheduled the morning. So even though this may not be maximum efficiency on the crew size, trust me, at the end of the day, nobody was complaining. So I'm placing these anchor bolts in these strip footings. And the work they are going to do is to hold the bottom plate of a pony wall down, a little short wall that's going to be supporting the floor joists, a pony wall. They're never going to take much strain, but the plans specify that they need to be on 4-foot centers with a bolt within 12 inches of the end of each board. Okay, overkill. All they're really going to be protecting against is sliding, so the bottom plate of that wall can't slide around. But it's important that they do happen in the bottom plate, so I have to get them in the center of this footing. Not only that, but I would prefer that they don't happen where the stud itself is supposed to hit. I would prefer that I miss the stud layout by some amount. So I've marked on the edges of the footing on the board the lateral location of the bolt, and I'm using the length of the bolt, it's a 12-inch bolt, to determine the center of the footing so that I get these things, where that board's going to be. You just kind of jiggle them. You work them up and down and jiggle them down into the mud. You push the mud out of the way and keep the mud moving so that it settles back in around that J-bolt. So it has, nice embedment and the concrete's in close contact with the bolt all the way down. So it's strong. Not too bad while the concrete's still loose, before it's begun to set up. But if you're not ahead of this game, if you get here too late and this mud's starting to get hard, it is not easy at all to jam it down in there, and the bolt is not as nicely embedded, and you just need to be ahead of it on this. And these are going right in, and you're going to get a chance to see how they actually do hold down that pony wall when we start framing this floor system. Everybody thinks that these trucks deliver concrete. And yes, I guess that is technically true, but really what it is delivering is anxiety in the form of a chemical reaction. That's what's happening when concrete gets hard. It's a chemical reaction. And it is certain, and it is relentless. And it gets faster as the day warms up, and you get more tired. And if you don't keep up with it, it will beat you up without mercy. And understanding this chemical reaction and how to stay ahead of it is one of the things that a good finisher has to have in his toolkit, along with muscle and endurance and confidence, and it certainly helps to have a sense of humor. The employment status of these men is a combination of subcontractors and their employees. These guys doing this sort of work on a day like this, on a job like this, are loosely referred to as day finishers. And one of the first best habits you can get into when you use men like these to get the work done that simply must be done is to pay them immediately if you want them to be a permanent part of your program. And pay them a little more than they are expecting if you want it to be easy to schedule them onto your next pour. So this is the last truck of the day. It's called the cleanup load. You know exactly how much footing is still needing concrete, and it's easy to measure and it's easy to figure the volume, and I think it was only 1.5 yards. And it showed up with the mud really dry or stiff. That means it was low slump, probably around a 1 or 2 inch slump, and that's hard. That's a harsh material to work with. And we didn't add water for a couple of reasons. First, it takes time to add water, and we were almost done. And we didn't want to set aside, 7 or 8 minutes to throw in a couple of gallons and mix it up and get it back down the chute. Have to deal with what was in the chute already anyway. And second, placing this material so stiff meant that it would quickly catch up or get hard to match the earlier mud at each end. And so it would make it sort of easy to tie everything in and not have hard concrete right up against soft concrete. It sort of made the process more uniform. And third, a low slump mix means a lower water to cement ratio, which means stronger concrete, because the water to cement ratio is the single biggest variable and determinant for ultimate concrete strength.